Bert can ask one deep discussion question during that one. Sorry, that's an inside joke. Yes, well, thank you for the invitation. I'm not going to talk about the brain, but if you have questions about the brain, I'm happy to talk about the brain, but it's not in slides. So what I'm going to talk about today is curiosity of negative things. So what we see in real life is that people are actually often exposing themselves to really negative things. I don't know whether any one of you have read this book, A Little Life. Well, those who have, I see people shaking their head. It's an extremely difficult book to read. It describes a lot of really negative events. And for some people, it's been like a really meaningful experience. And I find this very interesting. So why do people deliberately expose themselves to all sorts of negative things? And I'm going to talk today about 4 different categories: news, images and stories, and art. And I'm particularly interested in why do people do this? What do they think they can gain from engaging with negative information? So before we start, just a quick, I guess, a definition of what curiosity is. I don't know how many of you are even into curiosity as a topic. No, not really.
Interest.
Interest. Yeah, interest. Yeah. So there's a whole discussion about the difference between curiosity and interest. But curiosity is pretty much defined in the literature as a desire to know, to see, or experience that motivates exploratory behavior directed towards the acquisition of new information. And I've underlined exploratory behavior because that's what I focus on in my work. So I really focus on behavior, on choices to see something or to read something. And so my operationalization of what I call morbid curiosity is not about, that it is irrational or unhealthy, or sometimes morbid curiosity is used to say something about the person, but I'm using it to say something about the thing that people are curious about. Right, so I operationalize morbid curiosity as a deliberate choice to approach an intense negative stimulus that portrays or describes death, violence, or harm. And I will tell you a little bit about how I have operationalized that in a different studies. And I do that because of pretty much this idea that morbid curiosity, or the sort of decision to engage with something negative, is a sort of outcome of a cost-benefit analysis, right? And that's why I also distinguish between curiosity as a subjective experience and curiosity as measured by a choice. Because it's possible that you're curious about something very negative, but you think, if I'm going to look at this, I'm going to regret it, right? It's going to be something that is too much. The costs are too high. So you could have an experience of curiosity for something that you eventually don't choose to engage with, probably because the costs in that sense outweigh the benefits. And this is actually the other way around. But if you do say yes, that might be because you see that there are benefits in engaging with that information that outweigh the costs, right? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So what are those benefits? Like, what do people think they gain from engaging with negative information? Okay. So before I'm going to go into some quantitative work, I first wanted to share with you some qualitative work that we recently did, that was recently published in Cognition and Emotion, where we looked at particularly these benefits. And we asked people. So we asked people, okay, can you come up with a recent situation, where you deliberately engaged with the suffering of someone else that you did not know personally, so a stranger? And you get all sorts of different examples from people. You get documentaries, you get museums, online content, books. You even get, I saw someone who fainted on the street, and I didn't know the person, but I sat with them and made sure they were okay. Right? So you get a whole lot of very, very diverse set of situations. And then we ask people, so why did you do this? What was the reason why you engaged with this information? And we literally gave them qualitative. It was a lot. We had 247 participants. So we had a lot of different situations. And then we actually did a thematic analysis of all those different motives that people said there were reasons or functionality of engaging with that information. And what you can see is that you can sort of categorize them into 4 overarching motives that are also very consistent with the literature on curiosity and information seeking. And one would be effective, right? You're seeking an experience, an effective experience. So some people say, I did this because I expected to be outraged or angry, right? Or even sad, which is consistent with also some literature from the emotion field, that people also seek out negative emotions. Sometimes people want to feel sad, or they want to feel, outrage or something. Entertainment was also mentioned. Very, very little, but it was mentioned. And feeling better. So this idea of, there was, for example, someone who said, yeah, I read stories about shootings at schools in America, and that makes me sort of happy about living in Europe, for example, right? So that's sort of this idea of you're engaging with information, and that makes you realize that your situation is actually better than the situation of the person that you're reading about. Effective. Then epistemic, which are pretty much all about knowledge, right? So some people just said because I was curious or fascinated. So they talk about a subjective epistemic state. But a lot of people mentioned, I'm seeking understanding, I'm seeking knowledge, I want to know what this is like. There were a lot of examples about seeking information about other people's physical accidents, for example, mental health problems, and people want to know what that is like. And that's the reason why they engage with those stories. And then we had significant event, which is pretty much like because everyone was talking about it, because it was like super significant, and then self-relevant. Because this was something that happened to me, or because this is something that could happen to me, or my child, or my sister, or my mother. And then we had social motives, empathy. A lot of people mentioned compassion because they wanted to empathize, or they sought empathy. Helping desire, pretty often talked about in incidents on the street, for example. If you see someone who fainted that you didn't know and you decided to approach that person. And also social norms, things like this is something that you ought to do, right? This is what you are expected to do in a situation like that. And then eudaimonic, I don't know whether that is a term that you are aware or know. There's a difference in Greek philosophy between hedonic experience and eudaimonic experience. Hedonic experience is about seeking pleasure. It's about seeking nice things, good food, sex, and eudaimonic is about living a meaningful life. It's about seeking things that are meaningful to you, that make you live a good life, not as in a hedonic good life, but a good life in terms of your own personal development. So people say that, they say, this gives me insight into the human condition. That makes me a wiser person. This is a meaningful thing to know about, or it is in line with my values as a Christian, or, as someone who needs to inform themselves about these kind of things. But this is all qualitative, right? This is what people say, although they fit the literature. So now I'm going to show you a couple of different studies where we actually use these motives to predict actual information-seeking behavior. And all these, and I was told I only had 25 minutes. So I have sort of made an overview slide of what this is generally looks like. But if it's unclear how I did it for each separate study, then please don't hesitate to ask me a question. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, just as clarification for myself.
Yeah.
Morbid curiosity, is that exclusively about the curiosity towards suffering of people you don't know?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
No, not necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
I guess. I mean, I've never really looked at it in the context of being curious about the suffering of your partner, but I guess people are also actually quite curious about the negative events that happen to people that are close to them. So it definitely does not exclude that. But I'm particularly interested in strangers.
Yeah.
Because it's so widespread, right?
Yeah.
Because we see it, we do this all the time. I mean, maybe not. Some of you say I never do this, but most people do this all the time in news, on Netflix. But yes, I think it might very well also be something that people do in their own personal.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe people who don't like, for example.
Yeah. Well, that is also important to say that this is different from Schadenfreude. Because Schadenfreude is really that hedonic experience of seeking information about the suffering of another person. But that is very often something that happens in either competition situations or in situations when it's the suffering of someone you really don't like.
Yeah.
What I'm using mostly does not really fall into that category. Yeah. But it is, it was also, Schadenfreude was there, actually, there.
Yeah.
And some people mentioned that.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, do motives predict choice? Well, in the studies that I'm going to show you, there's always two phases. And one phase is there is a choice, or like a cue, like a journalist is attacked while covering a protest. And then a question is asked to the participant, do you want to see this image? And then the participant can make a choice, right? They can say, yes, I want to see it, or no, I don't want to see it. Here, nothing happens. They only make choices, so they don't really see anything yet. And then in the second phase, they see that same cue again, and they rate these predictions about what will happen when they engage with that stimulus, right? So seeing this image will expand my knowledge about the world, right? And you can, agree to that or disagree with that, but you can rate that to the extent that is applicable to you. And then we often had a whole set of different motivational dimensions, like about the impact of engaging with that stimulus, right? Reading this story makes me feel compassion. Reading this story will make me feel negative emotions. Viewing this image, so you see the point. And then we use these predictions, or these sort of rated dimensions, to predict the choice that they make here. Yeah? And when they make the choice, they haven't seen these yet, right? So the choice is pretty independent from rating those motivational dimensions. And so that's what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you for different types of stimulus material to what extent this predict the choice. So the first study was done during COVID, actually in April 2020. So when the World Health Organization had called it a pandemic, so it was still very, very uncertain. No one kind of knew what was going to happen. And we were interested in news, and particularly, I don't know whether you remember, all this different types of news that were out there about how many people were infected, how many people died. But we also saw that a lot of news was about stories, right? Stories about what the experience was like. So some of them were just stats, and other news headlines were about, about what it was like to have corona, or what it was like to work on a corona ward. Like, patients want to know the truth, no matter how horrible. It was about, what is it like to tell people that they're probably going to die, right? And we were interested in, why do people read this? Right? Because it's distressing. You're in it yourself, right? You have like a chance that you get sick. So we also thought, if it comes down to this self-relevant stuff, right? This idea of, can I actually prepare myself for a situation? Then that might be something that you could test in a worldwide pandemic when it's relevant for everyone. So we asked people to make choices whether they wanted to see or read a news article, yes or no. And we had two different categories. We had statistical news, and we had these stories, these exemplars that really focused on the experience. And then we looked at what predicted the choice. And it was actually quite, oh yeah, what I also need to say, we actually collected 800 participants. And then we separated the data set into an exploratory data set and a validation data set. And we did a first analysis on the exploratory data set. We left the 400 half completely aside. And then in the middle, we pre-registered exactly our model and our hypotheses that came from the exploratory data set. And the data that I'm going to show you here are confirmatory. So they are based on the the validation data set. And that's why it also has the pre-registered label. And choice for negative headlines is predicted by knowledge, which may not come as a surprise. So the more you think, you'll be able to understand a situation or form an opinion about a situation, the higher the probability of you saying yes. Moral duty. So the more you think it's your moral duty to engage with negative news, the higher the probability of you saying yes. And then here is self-relevance. So it's indeed, if you think that you can prepare yourself for an emergency situation by reading the news, then your choice probability of saying yes is higher. And this was replicated across the two different data sets. Then we didn't find any interaction with stats and sort of personal stories. And we then thought maybe if we put all the data together and sort of exploratory see whether we have maximum power, we still didn't find any interaction. So this is both for stats and personal stories put together. When we looked at the full data set, so I should actually say that this is 800, sorry, we actually found 4 other relationships. Compassion. So the more compassion you expect to feel, the higher your choice, which is actually kind of interesting because there's a whole literature out there in social psychology. I don't know whether you know that literature, that empathy is actually costly, right? So empathy is something that takes emotional and cognitive resources so that people might generally avoid it. But here we actually found that it was a positive predictor. Inappropriate, makes sense. If you think it's inappropriate, it's a negative predictor. Gratitude, which is something that I'm happy to talk to you about. It was a really weird finding when the more gratitude you think you feel, the less likely you are to say yes. All right, so some people ask me, is this not just about wanting to feel better? But that's not what we found. We found that people who think that they are going to feel grateful about their own situation, they actually choose the news less. They're less likely to choose the news. And then, which I think was a really interesting finding, although it was an exploratory finding, feelings. And that was actually a quadratic relationship. So what you see here is that the probability of saying yes goes up when people feel mildly that that is going to evoke feelings. When they think the news is not going to do anything to them, the probability goes down. When they think there are a lot of feelings that are going to be evoked, the probability also goes down, right? So it's like, this is really why this cost idea is so interesting, because this might suggest that if it's too costly, and you see it as too intense, you're not inclined to engage with information. But if it's negative news and you think it's not going to do something to you at all, you might also not engage with it. So in a way, this is consistent with this idea that people want to feel something, right? Or they expect to feel something. And we have seen this also in other work, that also with other negative stimuli, that people actually seek out the feelings that it may evoke. Okay. How am I on time?
It's 22 plus 3.
22. Okay, so I have 3 more minutes.
Right.
I'm not gonna make that.
Absolutely okay for TikTok.
Okay, so this is about news, right? So the next study, which I did with Anastasia Vivanco-Garlavari, was about choosing images and stories. So here we didn't go with news, we went with images and stories. So in the first set of studies, we actually gave people a description of an image. A journalist is attacked while covering a protest. And the question is, do you want to see this image? Yes or no? Same process. In the first phase, they made choices, and then they rated the predicted impact or anticipated impact of those images. And then in another set of studies, we turned it around and we gave them the image. And we said, do you want to read the story behind the image, right? Okay. So here, I know this is going to be, I had to push everything into 15 slides. So this is a very complicated graph, but I'm going to walk you through it. So again, we had the same procedure here of an exploratory phase and a validation phase. So this is a total of 4 studies, and these are the effects that actually replicated. So we're just tested in a confirmatory fashion. And what you see here, if it comes down to choice, it's actually quite interesting that for images, negative images were chosen less often than positive images. Or the probability of saying yes went down for when an image was or a description was negative, right? Which you might think, oh yeah, but that makes sense because seeing a picnic in a park, you know, why not see a picnic in a park? There's no costs, right? But seeing an attack, that's costly. So there might be a sort of cost-benefit analysis where the predicted costs might be so high that people say no for negative, but for positive, there are no costs. But for stories, it was actually the other way around. So for stories, people, negative images were actually predictor. So people had a higher probability of saying yes when the content was negative than when the content was positive, right? And that was also replicated. And it makes sense because then you have to put in effort to read this, right? Stories were not super long, and then, yeah, if it's a picnic in a park, I'm not really that interested in reading a story about a picnic in a park. I've been to 100 picnics in the park. But a story about a journalist who is attacked, that might actually give me some novel information. So there you see actually that it flips. So this is also, I think, an important aspect of this work, that how people choose may depend also on the medium. It might depend on whether it's visual information versus a narrative that only has text in it. Okay, and then we found the more people think, it helps them understand, the higher probability. Reduce uncertainty. Now, this is something that we didn't have in a news study, but here it was a super relevant predictor. And this is what a lot of people also say if it comes down to morbid curiosity. They get a video on their phone, right? A link to a video, and they're like, I kind of don't want to see. I'm kind of curious what it looks like. What does it look like? What is it? What does it look like? What is, is there going to be, how bad is it going to be? Is it as bad as I have it in my head? And that is what our operationalization of reducing uncertainty was about. So seeing this image will stop me from wondering what it will look like, or reading this story will stop me from wondering what it will be about, right? So it's simply, I will reduce my uncertainty by saying yes. And you see that that is a really big predictor. And that predictor is actually, in both studies, stronger for negative content than for positive content. So that's the only motive where we found an interaction that you can see here. So people actually, this is a stronger predictor for negative choice than for positive choice. Self-relevance was significant. Social norm, this is something I am supposed to do. Compassion was mixed. Thrill, important for both. Main effect, not only for negative, also for positive. And then positive emotions were actually stronger for viewing than for stories. But we also see that that was actually an interaction. So that was only there for positive images and not for negative images and stories, right? So if people don't really expect they're going to feel something positive when they see an image of an hurt person, but they do want to avoid negative emotions. because negative emotions was a negative predictor. So that's where the costs come in. If you think that this is going to evoke a lot of negative emotions, your probability of saying yes is going down. Yeah, I know this is a lot, but it's very consistent, right, with the news. Even though it's this different types of stimuli, it's very, very consistent. Okay, so that's images. And then this is art. This is my PhD student, Jan Rosberg, who's very interested in art. And we did a project on negative art, which is a little bit different from what I've showed you before. A couple of the studies in this paper are the same, use the same sort of process of rating motivational dimensions. But what I'm going to show you is the behavioral stuff. What we actually did is we asked people, now, there is a picture, or there's a man is being assaulted by two others. What do you want to? Well, we had different studies here, but this in the first study we gave them a non-art condition and an art condition. So here they know that they're going to see a painting. Do you want to see a painting? And here, do you want to see a photo? And here we did the same thing for a positive situation. The child expresses love to their grandmother. Do you want to see photo? Do you want to see, or here, do you want to see painting? And what we find is that for positive information doesn't matter. People say pretty much yes all the time, right? It's very kind of like, it's not ceiling, but it's high. In 80% of the cases, people say yes. But for negative, it makes a difference. People are much more inclined to say yes if it's a painting than if it's a photo, right? And we find that across multiple studies, we had a total of like 1,000 participants. And we've consistently find, and also if you ask them, okay, a man is being assaulted by two others. What do you want to see? Do you want to see a painting or do you want to see a photo? People prefer to see the painting. Yes.
Do they get to see the painting?
Yeah. So we had, this may also be important considering the discussion we had today. We actually piloted everything. So in the study before here, all the stimulus material was matched in terms of, like, for example, arousal and complexity and those kinds of things. And here, the photos and the paintings had the same type of content. So they're no, these are not the actual ones that we used. This is just art. No, this is I mean, this is Artemisia, I think. But I think we might have used this one actually.
That's actually been my question. I think.
Yeah.
Not an art specialist, but
No.
like for art there's a whole different image for the modern art museum.
Yeah.
Could be painted differently.
Yeah. So it's all figurative.
Okay.
Right. So it's all you can all see what's happening. And there were all moral violations. So there were all situations where there was a violation of some sort of moral thing. So it was a fight, or someone was being attacked, or a genocide, or something like that. And the images that we used actual veridical artworks. So the artworks that we use are real, like highly esteemed artworks, because we thought that was very important. And we found images, photographs that looked very much like the art in terms of content. So in both cases, the moral violation was exactly the same. And the content was also very similar, but in one, it was art, and in the other, it wasn't. Yeah? And so we find that, and people actually saw the art that they chose. And we also asked people to rate outcomes and motives. And generally, we find that art experience evoke higher aesthetic appreciation. So it's like negative, but at the same time, it also gives you this aesthetic appreciation feeling, which is also what is being predicted by models of why people engage with negative content in art, because of the mixture of the negative state with the aesthetic. And it was non-art gave people a more realistic perspective, and it was emotionally more costly. So people think art is less costly to engage with, which is really why this data would actually speak to a lot of societal, like, information giving situations, and that if you want to inform people about a negative event in the world, it might be something that you could do through art because people might find it less costly to engage with it and would therefore, be more inclined to seek it out. So, So in summary, in the moment, you make a decision about something in the moment, this uncertainty reduction might be very important, right? Because you have a mental image of what you're going to see or what you're going to read. On the long term, knowledge acquisition that might be more a long-term thing. So you might have an internal model of the world and you want to fill in that internal model, and negative events are part of the world. So if you want to have a realistic model of the world, you need to also, acquire knowledge about that, which is very much in line with current models of curiosity information seeking. Personal relevance and utility. You seek negative information if you think that it might be relevant to your situation or it might help you act. Social motives, moral duty, if you think it's your moral responsibility. And then affective motives are a bit mixed in that sense, because you might only do it when you don't expect to feel them or not as much, right? Or when you expect that you can cope with them. And coping, I don't know whether you know that term, but it's the idea that you can handle it, is something that is also now being incorporated into theoretical models of curiosity, that you're only going to be curious if you think you can cope with the information or with the emotions that it will evoke. But it might also suggest that people sometimes seek it out. They want to feel something, right? They seek out the information that makes them that makes them outraged or makes them activated. And then they're going to talk to other people and sort of continue to activate themselves. And that might actually be, which is a question I wanted to ask Bert today when he spoke in the ACE lab. Like, to what extent that is also something that might work in politics, right? That people are seeking out political information that makes them feel something because they want to feel something. They want to feel aroused, right? In a way, because it's, I don't know, meaningful to them. So yeah, that's a summary of the motives. For positive and negative content, they're very similar, right? So it's not like negative reasons to engage with negative stuff is completely different from reasons to engage with positive or neutral things. It's very similar. It's just that for some types of negative content, certain motives may be more pronounced. Like, for example, uncertainty reduction might be more pronounced for negative content because you've not seen so much negative stuff, right? How many accidents have you seen? How often does it happen that there is an ambulance going through your neighborhood? So it happens and you're like, oh, what is going on? What is going on, right? And that might be extra strong for these kind of deviant situations that are often, associated with negative stuff. Certain contexts may enhance the salience of motives, like aesthetic appreciation might be something that particularly is relevant for art. And then, of course, there are questions about, these are all short-term benefits, but we know that there are people who do nothing but doom scrolling all day, and that's not good for your general mental health. So it's an interesting question, like, how do these things, like, relate to each other? Do we have to look both at short-term costs and benefits and long-term costs and benefits? And what are they, and how are they weighed against each other? And then we're also at the moment doing some work on psychological distance. So the distance that you feel towards that stranger, is that stranger someone who feels close to you, with similar in terms of social group as you, or very different? And how does that actually make you more or less inclined to engage with their suffering? So with that, I will close. These are my people who I've worked with on these studies, and I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for this really interesting talk, Suzanne.
Yeah.
We now open the floor for questions. Let's start with Dan and then go to Jacob.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. What I'm curious about is also the opposite. So what are the predictors of why people are not curious?
Yeah.
Because I was thinking that it might be quite similar, right? So some sort of self-relevant events, moral, not duty, but the opposite of it, like justification, negative effect, also sort of outrage or envy or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So these are all of this work is based is done with multi-level modeling. So it's individual predictions, right? So if you knowledge, the idea that it will gain knowledge is predicting that you say yes, but if you don't think you're going to know anything or that it helps you understand, it is automatically predicting that you say no, right? So the absence of benefits would be the first predictor of saying no. If you don't think it's going to gain you any knowledge, then you, yeah, the likelihood of you saying yes is less. But there's also particular predictors like inappropriateness, which I think with some type of content may actually be quite important, particularly if we think about ideologically motivated negative material like ISIS beheadings and things like that. I think that might be a very strong motivator for people not to look at it. And then costs, right? So if you think it's going to be too overwhelming, then people are going to say no. And I think there it's mostly about the costliness of the emotional experience and not necessarily about the presence of emotional experience per se, right? So because for some negative content, people might be okay with the fact that it makes them feel bad because that's what, they think it will. Like if you watch a video of, I don't know, a certain American politician, you might know it's going to make you feel like irritated, but that might actually be the thing that you're looking for.
Like lack of empathy and lack of cognitive and emotional resources.
Yeah, lack of cognitive and emotional resources. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Those are the ones that I can say something about, but there might be all other negative. I don't know if you have any particular predictor in mind for that would predict saying no.
Well, if the opposite, so the negative effect of moral duty.
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah, so I think that is probably very close to the inappropriateness idea, that this is not a moral thing to do, to look at and I don't know, a video of someone who's being kicked on the street. That's not something you do. And then I would assume that for a lot of people, that would actually be a predictor of saying, no, I don't watch this.
Yeah, I think since you're talking about moral curiosity, you're probably mostly interested in the actual approach behavior and what makes people approach. And a question that I would have is, did you ever connect that to the actual experience that people have when engaging with the content?
Yeah.
Because
great question.
Two questions that I had there is like, on the one hand, you assume that people make a prediction.
Yeah.
And so is that prediction accurate?
Yeah.
Or on the other hand, it could also be the sort of validation question.
Yeah.
Right? People always say, I want to gain knowledge, but then you actually find out people never gain any knowledge.
Yeah.
Is that then just something that people
think, but doesn't come to pass?
Think or want to express.
Yeah, it's a good question. I forgot to put that in my discussion, but I'm super happy that you bring it up. Yes, we are now looking at outcomes as well, and it's very, very similar. So, for example, in the art project, we looked both at predictors of choice, but also at outcomes. And then you see that aesthetic appreciation is both a predictor, but also an outcome of engaging with art, for example. And also, if we look, for example, at knowledge acquisition or the reduction of uncertainty, you see that people also say that they feel like they've gained knowledge more with negative content than with positive content. So you see that outcome of something meaningful and something that gives you knowledge is actually stronger for negative things than for positive things. And you would expect that because there is more uniqueness to negative content probably than to positive content. So, but what I really, really want to do is exactly what you're saying, is to look at this from a predictive coding perspective, which I don't know whether all of you know, but to look at prediction errors. So to say, okay, people make a prediction about the extent to which it will make them gain knowledge or help them understand the situation. Then afterwards, you're going to see to what extent do they understand the situation, and you can calculate whether there's a prediction error, whether it was more than they predicted or less than they predicted. And then you can use that prediction error to predict the choice on the next trial. So if there is a positive prediction error, you would expect them to make more choices. And if it's a negative prediction error, then you would assume it would actually decrease the likelihood of saying yes, which is in my Year C grant that I'm currently waiting on to hear about. But yeah, no, that's actually where those two things would really come together.
Yeah, that's super interesting because I think my other question that I'm not going to ask, would have been if people
Yeah. Well, there you go. Yeah. No, it's great. Yeah, great.
We've got a question from Maaike, then I put myself into the queue.
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation. So I was wondering, so you study mostly motivations. Do you also look at traits of individuals? Because I can imagine that there's some people who are very disgusted by blood or anything violent, or are very anxious and usually affects.
Okay, so there are two answers to this question. One is yes, I look at individual differences, and you do see that choice for negative content correlates with some of the things that you would expect, need for cognition, for example, sensation seeking, but also sort of general curiosity, engaging with the suffering of other people, like stories about people's hardship is correlated with social curiosity. So there's definitely traits involved. What you're saying about what if people are very, easily disturbed by the problem with this research is that I have to deal with ethics, which is a good thing. And I think that people who are very sensitive are not going to be people who are going to be in my studies, because they read the informed consent and they see that it's going to be about negative stimuli and are like, no, I'm not going to do this. Although I often in my informed consent say that they can make choices so that it's all up to them whether they want to see stuff, it's still probably the case that people who are very, very low are not going to be part of my study. So it might be an overestimation of this kind of behavior in the book. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I was wondering how this relates to hate watching, because you started your first qualitative investigation with negative experiences of others, right?
Yeah.
But then going for after this, I could see everything also apply to hate watching, but you started differently, right? So how do you think this relates?
Well, I haven't never really looked at that. But I think that's really a good example of people really seeking that emotional how do you call it? Stimulation, right? So but I don't have any data on it, but I think it is interesting, particularly also with regards to what you guys are studying in terms of politics. I think it might very well be that people are deliberately seeking out those types of emotions and seek information that's evoking that, which might even have some sort of relationship to political polarization, so that the people who are really high on that polarization scale might actually be the people who are continuously seeking out to be emotionally evoked by this material.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I was thinking to your example of American politics. And of course, this could be seen as a negative experience for the Americans. Or I could see it as personal hate or personal negative feelings towards a person.
Well, it's interesting because you would think that people don't want to feel hate, but I'm not so sure that that's the case. I think that there might be people who are capitalizing on that, or are trying to sort of, I don't know, feed it. Well, I mean, okay, I guess, yeah. But this is something I just only came up with today when listening to Bert's talk about polarization. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to Ella and then to Gustavo.
Yeah, I think the differences you found are fascinating, and one possible explanation I just kept thinking of was that I was wondering if you considered was how real the event feels to someone.
Yeah.
So especially with this difference between people wanting to read stories versus seeing a picture.
Yeah.
Seeing a picture,
Yeah.
you never know, but probably it's going to be real. Whereas with reading a story or reading a description, you can just tell yourself this is fiction.
I agree.
And I think the art results also kind of reflect this.
Yeah, so I think you're right. It's funny because I have started with my work on morbid curiosity with the really, really graphic stuff. Right. So I don't know whether you guys know the IAPS data set, but in the IAPS data set, there are images that are about social scenes with violence, but there are also the open chest cavities. I started with the open chest cavities. Sorry, you're eating. But yeah, people also choose to engage with those kinds of images. It's lower, the rates are lower. But still, there are quite a lot of people who, even if they have like an alternative, like nice positive thing to look at, they still want to see it. And I think in a way, the motives that we're talking about are probably going to be the same. That would be my guess. My guess would be that they're probably very similar, even if the content is more extreme. Because even with something like an open chest cavity, it's still like, what is it going to look like? You know, I mean, this might be something that you guys have been thinking, like when I gave that example, you're like, have I ever seen that? How bad would it be? Like, how disgusted will I be? Might even be that, you know, I've also got some evidence for that people might be curious about their own response, right? So I think that, and we're going to start some work that is more in the very far reaches of people seeking out negative content online to see whether the motives are similar. But I think my guess would be that it would be similar to what we see here. But that people's, what do you call it? Sensitivity is just less, or that they might be in a way, more able to deal with really extreme stuff. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, you also mentioned need recognition on the way, and I think that a lot of researchers have been wanting a more behavioral measure for curiosity rather than using these maybe traits that relate more to identity rather than actual behavior. And I was wondering, on a descriptive level, let's say you give them 100, maybe you give them 100 normal pictures, and then you give them 100 threatening, disgusting pictures. And I was wondering, on average, how many pictures do people actually want to see? Do they try to see as many as possible?
So this is very individually different. So there are people who say no to everything. They're like, oh yeah, or they do it once and they're like, okay, no, shouldn't have done that. And there are people who say yes to 80 or 90%. So it's very individually different. But if you look at aggregates, then my first studies also involving more extreme images, actually, on average between 55 to 70% of the trials for social negative content. So not for the very graphic physical harm, but for social scenes that involve violence, you see that on average, people choose them in the majority of the time. So that paper actually looked at the difference with zero, not with zero, so any image, but the difference with 50%. So do people actually show a preference for watching negative over a neutral image? And then you see that they actually prefer that, so that it is a majority of the trials. Having said that, it differs a little bit depending on the context of the study. So that was done in the lab. If you have people do this online in their own environment, it goes down because people have their phone and all sorts of other stuff. If you do it in the scanner, which I've also done, what do you think? It goes up. Yeah, it goes up to 70% or 80%. Yeah. Probably because people are bored. Yeah. No, because you're in a scanner and you're like, oh, might as well. So this is so this is a hard question to ask. It varies. But it's definitely not some very obscure, rare behavior. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, to what extent do you think that the way that the subjects construe the images upon viewing might be motivated in some sort of way? So I guess the line of thought that I'm going in, are you familiar with the work of Susan Sontag?
Yeah. I actually cite her quite a lot. Yeah.
So she's got this whole discussion about war photography and presenting war days either different or similar to ours, based upon the audience that we're presenting to. Are you also familiar with Sylvia Hartman?
I'm not sure. I don't think so.
She's got this book called Scenes of Subjection. It's following a similar train of thought, and she's got this wonderful description, to the extent that it could be wonderful. His description of slave auctions and how slaves are singing and crying. And this is reconstrued by the slave owners as acts of celebration. We're transforming pain into pleasure. Or something like you know what the brazen bull is, right?
The what, sorry?
brazen bull. It was this kind of punishment that this Greek tyrant had back in,
I don't know, but I think, yeah.
So they'd shovel this, the condemned into this device called a brazen bull. It was a completely metal bull statue, and they'd light a fire underneath it, and they'd burn the person alive. But there was this, outlet at the mouth of the bowl that would transform the screams into song.
Oh,
It's pleasant, and they'd do it during parties, so it'd be enjoyable.
yeah,
And so what I'm thinking here is that,
Yeah.
maybe there's some motivation upon viewing something that's horrible to reconstrue it as something that's
Yeah.
actually positive.
yeah. Okay, so, oh, there are so many different answers to this question. No, the short answer is no. I never looked at that. I've never asked people. I have done a study where we asked people to create a mental image from the perspective of if you create a mental image that the decision might become, it might increase yeses because then uncertainty reduction becomes more salient. But we've never asked people, what is your image or what is the meaning of this image? There's a lot of work on reappraisal, which is coming from a completely different perspective that comes from the emotion regulation literature, that reappraising a negative stimulus into something positive is actually a way to regulate your own emotions, which is not, I think, what you mean, but that is, yeah, it might be a possibility that people who are better at, yeah, engaging with this stuff and internalizing it, that is a way of reducing the emotional impact. But that is not answering your question about turning it into something positive, right? That would be making it, yeah, it's very difficult.
It's, I guess to put a finer point on
Mhm.
it, part of my worry here is that it's not information seeking behavior so much as it is affirmation of
Yeah.
the extant beliefs.
Yeah,
So we go into this expecting to see a certain thing, and unsurprisingly, we see it because that's what we wanted to.
yeah, but I don't. But all the stuff that they see is novel, right? So it's not novel. It's not like, and they also do find it negative. So this idea of that they're translating it into something positive, I have never found that in my data. So there is no like positive. There's not a prediction that if people think it's going to evoke positive emotions, it doesn't predict choice for negative. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. And thrill seeking, sensation seeking could be in a way, I guess. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. Yeah, I would have to think about that. Yeah. So what you're saying is that because people have an idea that is in line with their worldview, they're only seeking it to affirm it.
That's a potential motivation.
Yeah. We do pilot our stuff for expectations like that. So we do all the images that you just saw in that study with stories and images. We do ask people, is this as negative as you expect it to be? Or is it as positive as you expect it to be? And if things are very different, we exclude those images because we don't want things that are suddenly completely different from what they think. But that has more to do also with ethics. And that's more about the valence and not necessarily about the content. But I think there might be definitely people who want to affirm worldviews. So if the content becomes more political, for example, I think that there definitely might be people who seek it out because they want to see something that confirms what they think. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, I mean, I was also thinking, well, maybe I don't want to accept the existence of their things that are actually this horrible. That this is fundamentally incompatible with how I understand reality to be.
Yeah, we don't really see that.
Okay.
Most people are actually arguing it the other way around. They're saying, I need to know this. This is something that I need to be aware of. Yes.
Okay, we've got time for another question from slides and then
Yeah.
lowers and then go to Bert if we've got question, if we've got time for that.
Short fast.
Yeah, yeah, I need to be somewhere at 4, so
Right.
I'll rush it. So you speak up, great presentation, by the way, really interesting. You make this distinction between positive and negative, and I was wondering if we can make this more fine-grained, by, for example, contrasting it with neutral content or contrasting the negative, or specifically disgusting or threatening or stuff that makes you angry.
Yeah.
Did you look into?
Yeah, I've done that. Yeah, that was like the first step that I haven't put in here. But the very first thing I did was to contrast it against neutral and to say, what do people prefer, negative over neutral or negative over positive? And there the neutral was often very much matched in terms of content. So if it was someone lying on the floor in a negative image, and there would also be a neutral image. And then they got to see not descriptions, but they got to see small thumbnails. So they actually they made their decisions based on images. And some of those images were very disgusting, right? So the graphic harm stuff. And some of them were attacking animals, which is more consistent with this threat kind of idea. What I want to do in the work is to keep the intensity of the stuff similar. So in all of the work, positive images are as positive as negative images are negative. So they're as far away from the midpoint of the valence scale as negative ones, so that they're both in a similar way emotionally evocative. I think if you would ask people for neutral stuff, I think they would just not look at it.
Yeah.
They just say no.
Yeah. But the reason why I'm interested in this is actually the independent variables. So would the same independent variables predict curiosity for the neutral and the positive contrasted to the negative?
Yeah, so I think what we find is that the same predictors are there for, they don't just, well, you don't find interactions, so it's all main effects. So they predict choice for positive and negative. But we've not looked at neutral because it's very, very difficult to ask these questions for something neutral. If you have people like watch a bucket of buttons and you say, how much compassion does this involve? People are like, yeah, what? So that's the issue. So they're all social and they're all emotional. So in all of the stimuli, something happens that involves people and that also involves some sort of like emotional event. But it's, I guess, a good question. And I think it is probably possible to generate neutral stuff that is very bizarre or positive things that are very bizarre. And I think then you might also start to see different types of choices. Yeah.
All right, that's unfortunately all we have time for.
Sorry.
We'll talk.
Well told. Thank you for all these very insightful questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. As a sign of our appreciation, we have a hot politics lab now. And as always, we also want to thank our sponsors, the European Commission and the NWO. Next week, we'll have a lab this so there will not be a meeting. And the week after that, we'll have a Graduate Friday where Delaney and Jacob are going to present their projects. And that will also be here in the Political Science Common Room. So hope to see you all there. And thanks again for coming.